This interview is under the auspices of the Maria Rogers Oral History Program of the Carnegie Library for Local History. Kenneth R. Hammond is a professor emeritus of psychology from the University of Colorado and has lived in Boulder for 60 years. We are at his home in the Academy in Boulder. It is December the 12th, 2008. I am Shirley Steele. Liz McCutcheon is filming. Ken, how and when did you get to Boulder all those years ago?
How and when did I get to Boulder?
Mm-hmm.
I first came to Boulder in 1945. I had been a merchant seaman during World War II. My ship returned to San Francisco in the early part of September. My wife and two children had been staying with her mother in Monticello, Utah, while I was gone. So my first thought, of course, was to rejoin my family, and so I drove immediately to Monticello, where I met her and my children. And after a few days, my wife and I decided that we'd like a second honeymoon, so to speak. And we got in the car and struck off for Colorado for no other reason than it being Colorado. We drove from Monticello, which is in southeast Utah, up up to Denver. From Denver, we struck off north, and as we were driving up Highway 287, we saw a sign that said, University of Colorado, 9 miles. I turned to my wife and said, that's interesting. I didn't even know there was a University of Colorado. Let's go and see it. And so we turned there and drove over to Boulder. And we were immediately, and when we got to Boulder, we drove up to the campus. We were immediately struck by its beauty and the beauty of this general surround, and thought, well, if there are universities like this, universities set in situations of this kind, I'd like to be a university professor. So we went back to San Francisco via Monticello, and I had just graduated from the University of California at Berkeley in 1945, and so I simply took up from that point, went to graduate school, received a PhD, and by a stroke of luck, there was a professor from the University of Colorado visiting Berkeley. I was introduced to her. We hit it off. She made arrangements, that is to say, she told her chairman at Boulder, Carl Munzinger, after whom the Munzinger Psychology Department is named, that she had met me and thought I was promising. He happened to be a good friend of the chairman at the University of California at Berkeley. And, well, that was that. I soon found myself in Boulder, Colorado, and I stayed there for my entire professional life.
That's interesting. You've had a full academic career and an equally full personal life. Could we talk a little bit first about the academic part of it?
Yes.
And your field and what psychology department was like then?
Well,
maybe you first.
About my field first. Well, I came to the University of Colorado with the assumption that my subfield of interest in psychology would be social psychology. But for reasons that are both partly a product of luck and for substantial reasons, I soon became interested in the field of judgment decision-making. I began to think about how many of our actions are guided by the judgments we make, and I also, unsurprisingly, since this terrible war had just concluded, that wars began with judgments that people made that that kind of activity was necessary. So I found myself immersed in that topic, and I continued to study it all during my professional life, and as I still do today. So at the time, there was no field of judgment decision making, and I don't know that I would have even have called it that, but I guess I would have called it said that I was interested in human judgment. For reasons that I think I can take, well, let me put it this way. I think I can take a little credit for initiating work in that field. And I published papers, but I also talked about it a lot. And about 10 years, I think about 10 years after I got to Boulder, I initiated a group to study judgment and decision making, that is, people outside of Boulder. And I simply, by virtue of having met various people in psychology, invited I think it was about 10 or 15 people to come to Boulder to talk about topics involving human judgment. Prominent among them were people who are still in the field. One I can name would be Paul Slovic, who's at the University of Oregon. In any event, together with a colleague named Gary McClelland, in I think the early 70s, we made that meeting an annual meeting, and that gradually the number of people attending the meeting gradually grew to be about 40, and I think on one occasion 50, and we realized that we had started something that had gotten out of hand. And so I think we had about 10 meetings in Boulder, perhaps not that many. They were roughly about 10. And so we decided to discontinue that. And some of the people involved in it simply set up a society for judgment and decision making.
Excuse me, were these people off campus, out of the city, or were they part of the campus?
Oh, the people who came to the meetings were all off campus.
Okay.
Gary McClelland and I think were the only two from Boulder. Some graduate students as well were here, but the majority came from off campus. And so that was a very successful effort, and that society now includes about, I think, 1,000 or 1,500 people. So that's the nature of my...
What was the, while this was all going on, What was happening in the psychology department? Were they oriented toward this kind of study?
In the psychology department of Boulder.
Yeah.
Well, when I arrived, I made the 7th person to be in the department. So there were just 7 of us at the time I arrived. And the department just grew very rapidly. It grew by about 2 to 4 people every year until it reached a number of 50. And I think there are 50 people in the department today. And it's a rather good department. It has good quality people today. I think it's one of the best departments on the campus.
I don't think we said what date you started as a psychologist here.
What state I started?
What date you came to CU? When you came to CU?
Well, I started California.
No, but when you came here.
Yes.
In the department.
Yes.
When you came, when your tenure started at.
And what about when I came here?
Yes. When was that? What was the date?
That's right. We haven't. I visited here in 1945, but I came back with a PhD in 1948.
Okay.
I was very lucky. I was immediately admitted to the department at Berkeley, and I worked very hard, and I got my PhD in 3 years, and came here immediately. Again, a marvelous stroke of luck.
What kinds of students did they have in, say, in 1948 to 55, or of that period at the beginning? What were the students like?
Well,
if you can generalize.
Yeah, the undergraduates were, in terms of quality, were fairly good students, but not really highly intellectual students. But they were, my recollection of them is that they were very nice people. Mm-hmm. Now, on the other hand, I was not terribly impressed with their intellectual abilities. The graduate students were pretty much the same. The graduate students generally came from the Middle West. And I must say that the students were, but they were all very highly motivated and likable.
What did they look for when they finished school? What kinds of careers were they thinking of?
Well, most of them, the graduate students.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, the graduate students all hope to have professional careers. Their highest hopes, of course, were to be hired by a university, mm-hmm. and some of them were. Well, I would guess that a quarter of them were hired by universities, but there was a great demand for college professors in those days. It was a good field to enter. Of course, the pay was very poor, but we used to have a saying that if you took a job with a university, you were taking the vows of poverty. But of course, that gradually improved till got to the point where a university professor earned a reasonable salary, about average. Now the professors earn, at least the best ones, earn very good salaries. Did I answer your question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm tempted to ask, what was a beginning professor's salary in the 50s?
In the 50s? Mm-hmm. Well, I remember very well what my salary was. And it was $3,600 a year.
Oh, my.
Later on, I had the opportunity to laugh when that same number became my monthly salary.
Did the
and it's true that the salary was low because it meant you had a low living standard. I can remember when we, with my wife and 2 children, really didn't have enough money to get through the month. Mm-hmm. Oh, and that resulted in a very curious situation. So we'd run out of money for buying food at the end of the month. However, there was a store in Boulder, I'll call it a grocery store, that provided credit, so that you could buy on credit. And oddly enough, it was an excellent store, but that meant the prices were very high. So that at the end of the month, we lived very well on borrowed money.
Where did you live?
Where did we?
Yes.
The same place I lived all the time. I lived in Boulder, at the corner of 18th and Columbine, 18th Street and Columbine Avenue. I lived there until after my wife died, and then I moved here to the academy to live with Hetty Page.
And you had 2 children?
I had 2 children.
2 girls.
Pardon?
2 girls.
2 girls. Both of them are still living and are the joy of my life.
Getting away from the university just a little bit, what did you do if you had spare time? What was your life like?
Spare time. Well, my spare time in the beginning, of course, was pretty well occupied by my family. And my family and I enjoyed the outdoors, and we loved the outdoors around Boulder. It was a wonderful place to live. And that's really, it's what that's where my recreation was. Hiking and camping and the like. All 4 of us liked that very much. Later on, my recreation consisted of, I became interested in horses, and my wife also liked horses, and so we spent a lot of time with them. And however, I also, then after that period was over, I began to play tennis a great deal. I had played tennis when I was a youngster in high school and so on, and I spent a lot of time playing tennis. So horses and tennis were my principal recreation after we got by the camping and so on.
Where did you keep your horses?
Well, at first we kept the horses where the present law school is. That used to be the university had a big pasture there, and they didn't do anything with it. And so I kept my horses there because there was also a barn there. And then when the university developed that for the law school, I moved horses to where the present dormitories are on Baseline, 30th and Baseline. And there were also big pastures there. In fact, it was a turkey farm and a livery stable. And then when that got developed, I moved out to a corner of Baseline and Cherryvale. There were about 200 acres there that I leased. And that's where the present Bobolink Trail begins. That was a very nice arrangement.
Kind of interesting that it sort of reflected the growth of Boulder. Your horses
exactly. Yes.
moved away and
yes.
further and further out.
Yeah.
What was it like on where you lived?
What was it like where I lived?
Yes.
Well, when we first moved there, the streets weren't paved, there were no sidewalks, and it had something of a rural atmosphere. The end of the city really ended about 3 blocks south of us, and so that of course is before Noah came in, and before any of those buildings were there. That was all pasture land, and the road going south, Broadway going south from Baseline, was just a 2-track road. There was just nothing there, and there was just no road. The Baseline itself became a 2-track road after it crossed Broadway, and there was no 28th Street or anything of that sort at that time. My daughter, I can remember my daughter riding her horse from our house on 18th and Columbine down the street to down Baseline, to where Broadway would now be, and down where 28th Street is now. She would ride down there, ride north there to what were the Pow Wow grounds, and what is now this commercial establishment just north of Arapahoe. The Pow Wow grounds were a big thing in Denver in Boulder at that time, because that's where the Pow Wow event was held, which was sort of a rodeo and horse show.
What time of the year was that held?
What time of the year?
Yeah.
Oh, in the middle of the summer.
Oh,
I don't remember the exact date.
Can you talk a little bit about it?
The Pow Wow? Mm-hmm. Well, when Boulder got started, it was primarily a group of people who had various stores, and they made their living selling mining equipment, selling equipment to the people who ran the mines that were operating up Boulder Canyon. In fact, there's something called Valentine's Hardware that was a very prominent commercial establishment in Boulder, and it was primarily for mining. For miners. There was some agricultural activity, of course, around Boulder, but it was minimal. Well, I shouldn't say minimal, but the farms were not very large, and they didn't employ many people. But mining was much more active. Well, somehow people in Boulder, say after the turn of the century, decided that they ought to have some kind of event in the middle of the summer. Almost I would guess every small town out west had some kind of summer event. And so Boulder's summer event was called the Pow Wow. Now, I don't know who thought of that name, but Indians were fairly, I suppose I should say Native Americans, were involved to some extent, but it was primarily an event that was run by both miners and the agricultural people. The miners had various kinds of events that tested the skills of miners. All I can remember is that they usually involved hammers of some kind, and but they had several events that they put on that involved competition among the miners, and then the agricultural people, of course, had a rodeo. And the horse people kind of tagged on to that with a horse show. But that became a very big event in Boulder, and there would be a parade, and there would be, I think, the powwow itself could last 3 or 4 days. And then they imported the rodeo that traveled around the West. And so the rodeo performers who performed up in Cheyenne, which is a big, big rodeo, lasted for about a week and brought all the top cowboys in the West. Those people, Boulder tagged onto that so that they would catch those people after they finished the rodeo in Cheyenne. They would come to Boulder. So Boulder had a much bigger and better rodeo than it really deserved, just by virtue of its timing and its location. And that was the big event of the summer, the parade and the powwow. The mining events gradually dropped out of the powwow events as the miners left Boulder, and the agricultural aspect of it grew larger and larger. It didn't have the characteristics of the county fair. For example, Longmont got the county fair. And the county fair, housewives would present their whatever kind of foodstuffs they were expert at. I always tried to get my wife to enter one of her pies in the competition, but she refused. And the women exhibited things that they made, and so on. That went to Longmont. I think, but I'm not sure, that Longmont still runs the county fair. But Boulder stuck with this agricultural event. And it drew people, it drew a lot of people. It was a big thing.
When did it die out?
I'm not sure,
okay.
but it disappeared, and I guess it disappeared when the commercial interests in Boulder decided they could do something better with that land than simply have it sit there idle.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yes.
There was a man in Boulder who was quite wealthy, who supported the powwow events and controlled it. His first name was Raleigh. I can't remember his last name, but he was a very prominent individual in Boulder, and he really controlled that whole event, which was the biggest thing in Boulder until it just didn't exist anymore.
Did you and your family participate, or did you just watch?
Oh no, we participated. I was the president of the Quarter Horse Association, and we put on the horse show. And I didn't participate in the horse show, but one of my daughters did. One of my daughters took up horsemanship and participated in the National Western Stock Show, won a prize, but that's the extent of our participation. Although I participated pretty heavily in arranging the horse show and so on.
I'm kind of interested in what the transportation within the city of Boulder would have been like. Would you walk to the university? Or
well, I walked to the university all the time that I worked there, but the transportation was, as I recall, pretty poor. When I first came to Boulder in 1948, the tracks of the electric train that ran from Boulder to Denver were still visible, but there was no longer an electric train that ran to Boulder. So that lack of transportation was recognized by the town fathers, who soon agitated for the Highway 36 to be installed. We called it the Turnpike because at that time it was a toll. It started out as a toll road, and I remember our family drove on the toll road the day it was open, and the toll was 50 cents.
From where to where?
From
Here?
From Boulder to Denver.
Okay.
It was so successful that the toll was rather quickly reduced to 25 cents. And of course, the toll was removed altogether. The toll road is essentially Highway 36 today. There have been some improvements and so on, but that's essential. Now that made a tremendous difference to Boulder. I think it was about that time that the powwow grounds disappeared. Boulder became much more cosmopolitan, in my view, once the toll road once the turnpike was established. Prior to that, you had to drive out Arapahoe until you came to Highway 287 and then drive south. That was the way you got to Boulder. Couldn't stand that very long.
You did some other things in your spare time things. You said something about boating? About small boating?
Oh, I did that when I lived in San Francisco.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, San Francisco Bay. But I never did any sailing.
I wondered about that.
Yeah.
where the lake was. Were there things that you got involved with in the power structure of the city, the political structure, the planning and so forth?
No, I never got involved in the political structure of the city. I just didn't want to participate in politics. I was completely absorbed in my work at the university.
Did they ever reach out to you and say, you know a lot about judgment and decision making, and help us out here?
That happened a couple of times, but it really was not the kind of thing I wanted to do, and I don't think I was very effective in doing it. So I never I never ran for office or anything of that sort.
Well, your academic career was sort of primary in
Yeah, it was really my whole life.
Yes. Going into...
Well, I perhaps should tell you one thing that was pretty important to me. At about 1970, of course, I had been affected in my thoughts by the Vietnam War and that tragedy. And also I could see around me a lot of what I thought was useless conflict. And I got involved in the problem of interpersonal learning, how one person learns about another person, what their views are, how one person learns from another person about what their views are, and how they reduce disputes that are essentially cognitive in nature rather than motivational. That is to say, I wasn't particularly interested in the who gets what kind of dispute, but the kind of dispute that involves what should be done. And I thought that related directly to conflict of a kind that might describe as war. And I developed a paradigm, a research situation for studying that. And it was pretty good, if I do say so myself. And I earned a certain amount of recognition for that. although I've been terribly disappointed that it hasn't caught on and is not being used today. But it gradually began to catch on in the 70s, and I acquired a certain amount of visibility in connection with that and in connection with Denver, and I'll tell you about that. It was around in the 1970s, that early 70s, maybe, that Denver found itself in an awkward situation. Back east, people had discovered there'd been a dispute about the kind of ammunition that the police should use. And somebody had discovered that some police department had discovered that it would be more practical for them to use what they called what was then called a hollow point bullet. The idea being that a hollow point bullet, when it hit somebody, would flatten out and would knock the person down, whereas the standard bullet that the police used was a round-nosed bullet, and then when it hit someone, it continued on through them. Sometimes people didn't even know that they'd been hit, and it didn't stop them from doing what they were doing, which was what the police were interested in. Well, that created a fuss in the cities where the change was attempted, because some people saw the hollow point bullet as a soft-nosed bullet that had been used in World War I with very severe results. What the soldiers in World War I discovered was that if they took a knife and made a cross, simple cross like a plus sign, in the nose of the bullet, that when the bullet hit someone, it would flatten out and cause a much bigger wound than the round-nosed bullet. And so that was seen, they were called dum-dum bullets. And so when people like members of the ACLU keep a close watch on the police, for which they should be praised, saw this hollow point bullet doing the same thing, they called it a dum-dum bullet, and this was used as an example of police brutality. The police really didn't have a good answer to that, but it became a battleground between the police and organizations like the ACLU and so on. The police would claim that they were being outgunned by the criminals who had access to such ammunition. And so while that was going on in the courts in the East, the police chief in Denver decided, that's a good idea. He would like to have his policemen using these hollow point bullets. Well, once that hit the newspaper, there was a considerable outcry, and it got the dispute became very visible and very sharp. And then one night, a robber or someone who was attempting to rob someone was stopped by a policeman, and this person shot the policeman right in the heart and killed him. And it turned out that this shot that killed the policeman was a hollow point bullet. At that point, the police became enraged, because here was proof that their enemies were being allowed to use ammunition that they weren't being allowed to use. So the police, on one occasion, actually all walked off their posts in Denver and went to the city hall and confronted the mayor and demanded that they be allowed to use hollow point bullets. The mayor at that time said that he would not he would not restrict them from using hollow point bullets, but he would not say what kind of bullet they should use. He would leave that open, which was just his way of wriggling out of the situation. Well, that left the city in a turmoil and in a very tender position. And this is the time, about that time we were at the end of the 60s, and there were riots over the Vietnam War. Well, Boulder was perfectly pitched to have a riot over this kind of thing. So people were quite worried about this, particularly the Denver City Council and so on. I had a friend who was on the Denver Post, who was on the editorial staff of the Denver Post, and he knew something about what I was doing with regard to, his name is Larry Weiss, by the way, and I had dinner with him yesterday. And he was aware of what I was doing with respect to conflict resolution, and he was also very aware of the tender situation the city was in. So he went to the mayor, he went to the chief of police in Denver, and said something like, I have a friend at the university, and he thinks he knows how to reduce disputes like this. Would you be willing to sit down with him? And the chief of police, who was at the end of the rope, said yes. And then he went to someone who was going to be elected mayor. He was at that time, I think, the district attorney, and asked him if he would sit down with the chief. Told him the same story about this professor that he knew, and asked him if he would sit down with the chief, and so he agreed. And so at that time I had discovered, so we set up a meeting between the three of us, or Larry Weiss did, and so at that time I had discovered the use of computers in studying human judgment. So I actually carried what was a fairly large, there were no laptops at that time, computer to Denver, and set it up. In fact, we took two, set it up with the police chief and the attorney. To make a long story short, after a few minutes, I was able to show both of them that they really had the same aims, and they didn't have anything to quarrel about. They were both were astonished, of course, and so then the question was, what do we do next? And so they said, well, would you be willing to work this out with us for real instead of just an example? And I said I would. So they began to talk to one another about how that would be done, and they immediately, of course, were at one another's throats. So there I was watching these two guys argue with one another and seeing that it was going nowhere. And I simply told them, okay, either you want me to work with you or you don't. If you don't, I have to go back to Boulder. And that brought them back to reality. And they said, okay. And so we went ahead with it. And again, to make the long story short, it was a very successful effort. And when we showed the results to the city council, they were very happy to accept them. That got my name in the newspapers, but that's as close as I ever came to any kind of serious activity within the city politics.
Just in terms of recollection, and this, from what you were saying, brought it to my mind, were you here or aware of the anti-war demonstrations in the 70s?
Oh, sure.
And what do you recall about it? They took over Regent Hall, didn't they?
Oh, you mean on the campus?
Yes.
Well, they were just like what you might expect. There would be a few hundred students who would mob a certain building. They mobbed the building that I worked in. They mobbed a couple of other buildings. They weren't, well, they were serious efforts, but a few people were injured. It wasn't anything like the major effort. But I noticed, if you'll know, there's a bookstore at the corner of, what would it be? The one that's right across, the one that's on Broadway, just at where the university has the corner. Mm-hmm. If you look at that bookstore, you'll see it has a rather strange structure. It has solid cement walls. Well, before these riots took place, those were glass walls. So one of the first things that happened was that the students smashed all the windows in the bookstore. And when they were replaced by cement walls rather than glass walls.
Wasn't there a car bombing at one point in your neighborhood?
I don't remember a car bombing, but I remember this event, that there's a building at the corner of University and Broadway that belongs to the university. It houses the Institute of Behavioral Science.
Yes.
And that's where I used to work. And there's an alley. It used to be, that building used to be a church. And there's an alley between it and a small apartment house that also belonged to the university's Institute of Behavioral Science. And during this period, somebody drove between those two buildings and threw a small bomb down into the basement of the church, or the erstwhile church, since it was Institute of Behavioral Science, and all science was held in bad repute by the rioters in those days, threw a bomb in there, and it exploded and did some damage. And I think perhaps the only humorous thing that ever came out of all of this, there was a professor, very famous professor named Kenneth Hammond, and at that time, who had an office in the Institute of Behavioral Science. And it turned out that when they threw that bomb into the, through the window and into the basement of that building, they hadn't realized it, but the bomb landed in the men's room of the building. So Kenneth Hammond, who had a brilliant sense of humor, claimed that the act was by the women's movement. He had a better phrase for it than that, but I can't remember it at the moment.
Were there leaders of the university that you recall that you'd like to talk about, that you'd like to mention? I'm thinking you had a long reign of different presidents during that time.
Yes, the president, Robert Stearns was president when I came here in '45. He was a rather conservative, but rather typical. He did the kind of things that university presidents do. He was, he resigned and retired, and then a man named Ward Darley, who was dean of the medical school in Denver, became president. He was an excellent president, I thought, And he did a lot of good things with the university, as I recall. Don't remember what they were, but that was my impression. After Darley, there were other presidents. The only one that I think was memorable was Quig Newton. And Quig Newton was president during the McCarthy times. And during the time I mentioned earlier, we were talking about David Hawkins, and he handled the Hawkins situation rather well. He had a faculty committee look into it. And
hey, excuse me, we were talking about it off camera.
Yes,
so maybe you ought to just summarize it briefly.
Well, that's what I was going to do. I was going to say that David Hawkins was probably the foremost professor on the campus at that time. He had been the librarian, the historian at Los Alamos, the home of the atom bomb, and a close friend of Robert Oppenheimer's. But Hawkins was now at the University of Colorado in the philosophy department, and clearly the best scholar on the campus. But when Hawkins was a student, he had, at the University of California at Berkeley, he had in the 30s and 40s, he had joined the Communist Party. He resigned from the party in 1943, but he went to before he went to Los Alamos, but the McCarthyites soon sniffed him out on the campus, and they had him hauled up before the House Un-American Activities Committee, where Hawkins performed very well. He did not name any other names, although that's what the committee was after, but was perfectly open about his own activities. If I remember correctly, Hawkins had to testify twice. So he was the most prominent person. There were a couple of other faculty members that had to resign because of their previous participation in the Communist Party. One of them, I think, went to live in England. Mm. But we didn't have any. Hawkins was by far and away the most prominent name during that time. And for those who are interested, you'll find that Hawkins has his history is on the oral history program.
Did the rise of Naropa have any effect on the on CU?
Not that I know of.
During those years, it started to become a little bit more prominent. The Buddhist community.
No, not that I know of.
Okay.
I mean, we knew that it existed, but it didn't have very much status among the faculty at the university.
I want to take just a break just right now. I wanted to ask you about the town versus gown in Boulder and CU. Were you aware of problems there? Are there problems there?
Well, I was aware that there were problems, but as I think back, I can't recall any terribly serious issues. Mm-hmm. That is, I can't recall issues where, say, people on the city council denounced members of the faculty or denounced the university administration because they're some terrible act they've done. I can't recall serious disputes over, say, parcels of land. There was some dispute, as I recall, over the university buying the land for the South Campus that's south of, or what's called the South Campus, south of US 36. And I'll bet there aren't 3% of the population in Boulder that knows that the university has that land out there. My hearing aid battery is dying, but when it does...
You'll let me know.
Yeah.
The one interesting piece of information that I got from that application that you filled out for the sesquicentennial, you said you had been a tutor in an elementary school, and I was wondering, how did that happen?
Oh, it happened simply because after my wife died in 2003, I found that I was lonely and didn't have all that much to do with it. As I had a lot of my own professional academic work to do, but that left me isolated and in the house, and so I had read about the I Have a Dream Foundation. Oh. And so I simply went there, and I understood that they needed or might need volunteers. So I went there and volunteered, and they sent me to Lafayette. I can't remember the name of the school, but I went to Lafayette. It was primarily Spanish-American kids or Hispanic kids, and I went there and simply helped out with kids primarily, I think, in the 4th grade. And I enjoyed that. I was quite happy in doing it, but as you know, I have impaired hearing, and it got worse while I was there, and so I began to think that I was becoming a problem rather than a helper, and so I told them that I really shouldn't continue. Kids were having to repeat what they said to me, but I have to tell you that the children were really wonderful, and so when they found out that I was leaving, one of them announced one day to a group of about 12 or so that Ken isn't going to come anymore. And somebody said, well, why not? So the reply was, well, he can't hear. And somebody said, well, one of the kids said, well, we could all just talk louder. So I was really touched by that.
So it's conflict resolution on the 4th grade level.
Yeah, right.
I wondered, I know that you just finished a couple of years ago, you just finished in your, what, 12th or 13th book?
Yes.
And what are you doing now to keep busy?
Well, I did finish that book. It came came out in January, February of 2007, and of course it's too late for me to write another book, although I have ideas, but I'm 92 years old and I don't have a secretary, I don't have any help of any kind, and I just couldn't do another one. I can write papers, however, and I just gave a paper at a meeting a few months ago, but I don't think I'll do that again. But I want to publish that paper, and I have, strangely enough, my mind seems to work pretty well. It's true that I forget names and I forget things that proper names and so on, but I can still think clearly. This surprises me. But I can think clearly, and I have ideas. Are you telling me it's over?
I'd like to hear more about your ideas. Right now, we're going to come to a close.
Okay.
And I want to thank you for a very, very interesting interview.
Well, it's my pleasure. What are we going to do